So, as usual, I'll start off Le'iloi Nishmas. I've mentioned before, there's this guy Nick Sandler who lives out in Los Angeles. Actually, was just by his house on Sunday night. What is that? 3 nights ago. I'm a little tired. I got in last night at about 3 a.m. But so I was just by his house 3 nights ago, giving sort of this year a version of it. I mean, I'm always like tweaking and whatever it is, but a version of this year. He was very nice to host, and he gave me a ride from the airport to the airport. So this is Le'iloi Nishmas, both of his parents. There's Shmuel Aryeh ben Naftali Hertz and Batya bat Avraham Yitzchak. They should both have a Eloi Neshama, and this shiur should be a benefit for them. So, although it's Parshat Vayeshev, and I will tie that in a little bit, we're also, 6 days away from Chanukah, so I thought I would touch on an issue that involves Chanukah, and again, it'll tangentially, just slightly touch on the Parsha. Before I get into the main issue that I want to do, I just want to share with you an idea from Rav Kook. Right, so Rav Kook, who's famously known as the first Ashkenazi chief rabbi of Israel, modern state of Israel. A lot of his writings are very, very complicated. He has this very flowery language. He was trying to kind of bring the generation closer to Judaism. He felt like, because so many of them were into literature and poetry, so he tried to write in a very flowery way, and part of it is, it's very, very difficult. But he has a number of books that he wrote actually, things that he wrote while he was in Europe. And one of them, it's a sefer called Midbar Shor, basically before he made, Aliyah, I guess. I don't know if they called it that in those days. This was in the 19th century. He was actually a shiur Rav, I don't remember the name of the community, somewhere in Europe, and he wrote down a number of his drashot in a sefer called Midbar Shor. And he doesn't have anything specifically dedicated to Chanukah, but he, in Parshat Bahalotcha, which always ends up getting tied into Chanukah Parsha, it's actually part of what we read on the 8th day of Chanukah. It starts off with about the lighting of the menorah. So he has a little bit over there that I just think is important to just frame in terms of tonight's year, and in general anything that we learn that sometimes maybe deals with challenging or potentially challenging questions. He points out that there was what was called a ner tamid, and according to the Gemara, it's a question as to which one it was, whether it was their menorah in the Beit HaMikdash was 7 branches, not 8 like ours. But let's say, for argument's sake, it's certainly one of the two opinions of the Gemara, that the middle one was the ner tamid, was the kind of the constant one, and it says that the other. They all, basically the wicks had to point towards the middle. So he develops this whole idea over there, and he speaks about the fact that there's various categories of wisdom. I think I forgot which week we spoke about this, but who was it? I forgot who it was. Which scientist came up with the idea of the 7 colors of the rainbow. And that we said that it's not that there's really 7 colors, but he was into some idea that there was 7, all these things with 7. So there's this idea, I don't think it really exists anymore, but there's an idea that there's 7 branches of wisdom. So, Rav Kook just points out, he says that there's many different types of wisdom, and he talks about the kind of the challenge between both, being individuals and kind of going in the direction that, for lack of a better term, our soul takes us, our mind takes us, our personal interests, and also being part of the community. In other words, you want to be an individual, but not such an individual that you're just completely on your own. And he says that that's it with wisdom. We all study what it is that interests us. We follow what interests us, but we always have to be facing towards that ner tamid, which he says represents Torah. And the idea is, and I think it's a good one in general. When we're going to deal with potentially challenging issues, is that we can ask difficult questions, and we can learn anything. Anything from the most rational to the most mystical to the academic, whatever it is that we're going to deal with, as long as we kind of remember that ner tamid in the middle, that we're kind of always trying to have God as the focal point. In other words, I think that even difficult, uncomfortable questions can be dealt with in a way that we don't have to be afraid of asking them, as long as we kind of have emunah formally placed right in the middle, so that there's not any confusion in terms of where our loyalty lies. So with that said, one of the, I guess one of the issues that's a little challenging potentially when it comes to Hanukkah, basically, everybody knows the Hanukkah story. In the mid 2nd century BCE, the Greeks had basically taken over Israel, and they along with their Jewish followers, the Yavnim had turned Israel, had basically ruling over Israel, and not just politically, but also religiously, and they were trying to enforce Greek ways upon the Jews. And, of course, the Maccabees, they came and they drove them out, and then we have the miracle of the oil. And the challenging thing that exists over here, or at least the potentially challenging thing, everybody notes this, and there's all sorts of issues from academic through more like a more religious approach, is that when we look at the primary sources from that time, which again, for the first and the only Jewish holiday is actually not from Tanakh, it's actually just in regular secular writings. When we look in those sources, they all talk about the military victory, and there's no mention whatsoever of the miracle of the oil. And the question is, what do you do with that? The primary sources, right? Anybody remember from Jewish history? Not if you were in my class, because right? And Josephus is actually a little bit later, but right. There's book of the There's two books. There's Book of Maccabees 1 and the sequel. Maccabees, they're back. The second one. No, really, the Maccabees 1 was really that was the real legitimate source, and then Maccabees 2 was kind of like a wannabe, pretending, kind of like building on that. So in Maccabees 1, again, it talks about the military victory, and in Maccabees 2 as well, there's no mention at all about the miracle of the oil, which again doesn't necessarily prove anything, but at least it raises a question: what's going on over here?
Who wrote the book?
I don't know who wrote it, but again, it's a secular book, and I think it's part of what we call the Apocrypha, which are certain books which are written kind of like towards the end of or maybe after the books that make it into Tanakh. That I think they actually make it into the New Testament, if I'm not mistaken. Certainly nowhere near, even an advanced beginner in that, but I'm pretty sure it's in there.
In a hotel in Los Angeles?
Right. Well, actually wasn't, but that's the thing. I've never actually read it when I go there, but when I go to a hotel. But I'm pretty sure the Apocrypha are actually included. But they're not religious books, but it does mention it. But again, nothing with the oil. And then Josephus, who's not that far afterwards, you're talking about maybe 200 years afterwards. Again, he talks about the military victory, and he even says that the holiday is called, the holiday of light. But he says, I don't know why. Maybe there was some sort of great revelation of light from heaven, but he doesn't have any familiarity with anything that would make, we would hear, why is it called the holiday of light? Because of the miracle of the oil. But Josephus has not heard of that, which again raises the question, why not? The first time that it appears is in the Gemara, right? Right, unlike with every other holiday, literally from Shabbat, certainly the Shalosh Regalim, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, even Purim, which is the Rabbanan. Every holiday has its own Masechet in the Gemara, except for Hanukkah, which is again has very. There's a little bit in Masechet Shabbat. We'll talk about why in a second. There's a few other places where it's talked about, but for whatever reason, there's not an extensive, covering of this within the Gemara. What there is in Masechet Shabbat, in the second parak, the Ashkenazim say, which means the Sephardim probably don't. On Friday night, between Kabbalat Shabbat and Ma'ariv, we say, or Arvit, we say Bamem Medlikin. Okay, you guys, really? Wow, all right. I'm glad we're still part of the same people. So, right, it's a bunch of, it's basically the Mishnayot, the second parak of Shabbat, and it deals with, the beginning is Bamem Medlikinu, Vameh Ein Medlikin, and it deals with what are the wicks and oils that you're allowed to use on Shabbat, in terms of, lighting the candles, all sorts of issues that come up. And once it's there, you're talking about wicks and oils, Hanukkah also has oil. And there on Daf Chaf Aleph Amud Bet, have very, very famous Gemara. It says, it says, Mai Chanukah, which literally means, what is Hanukkah? Which is a strange question. This is already, whenever this is written, it's 300 years, 400 years, somewhere around there. After you would think that. They have Hanukkah. So Rashi kind of makes it a little bit, better sounding. He says, which miracle is Hanukkah really about? So he says, so it says, Detana Rabbanan, we have a Breita or something like a Breita. It's not, as we'll see, it's B'chavhei B'Kislev, Yomei de Chanukah Tmanya Inun. There are 8 days of Chanukah, but it's written in Aramaic, which means it's not really a Breita. It's actually from Megillah Ta'anit. There was a book, not a Megillah like in the ones that we read on the holidays, but there was a book of holidays and fast days from the second Beit HaMikdash, days that were kind of observed then, and basically almost all of them were not considered important enough that the Chachamim kept them. Chanukah is pretty much the only one that we keep from then. So this is a quote from there, and it says, "Delo lemispeid bahon." We don't have eulogies on them because again, it's a happy day. Udelo liit anot bahon, and that we don't fast on them. Now that's the end of the quote from Masechet Ta'anit. But now this Breita continues on, and it says, "Shenichnesu Yevanim laheichal." The Greeks entered the courtyard of the Beit HaMikdash. Timu kol hashmanim shebeheichal. They made impure all the oils that were in the courtyard. Ukeshegavru malchut Beit Chashmonai. And when the what's it called, the kingdom of the Chashmonaim, the house of the Chashmonaim became stronger. Interestingly, he calls them kings. V'nitzchum, and they beat the Greeks. Badku v'lo matzu el pach echad shel shemen. Here we get the famous story. They only found one little jug of oil. Shahaya munach b'chotamo shel kohen gadol. It had the seal of the kohen gadol. V'lo hayabo el la'adlik yom echad. There was only enough to last one day. Na'aseh bo nes. A miracle happened. V'liku mimenu shmona yamim. 8 days. Wonderful. Okay, just like we've spoken about before. And then it goes on and it says, Lashana acheret. It literally means a different year. And of course, there are different ways that this is read, but it certainly means later on. Some people read it as the next year, although I don't think that's the plain reading. Lashana acheret, a different year. Kiva'um, they established these days, these 8 days. Va'asa'um yamim tovim, b'halel v'hoda'ah. They made it as days of Hallel, it's one of the holidays we say Hallel v'hoda'ah, and thanks to God. Interestingly, even when it says that there was a holiday, what does it not mention was established as part of the holiday? It doesn't say anything about lighting candles. It mentions that there was a miracle that there was a miracle involving oil, and they established it as a holiday. It doesn't mention any oil. It doesn't mention any idea of lighting it. So that's a little strange over here. I mean, it's certainly in terms of what we would expect. We would expect that at least by the time the Gemara shares us that it's already going to talk about that. Now, obviously, it is in the Gemara. I mean, you have Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai, famous machloket. Do you light 1 to 8 or 8 to 1? But it's but still, it's not, hasn't been formally, at least so far, set up that there's a connection between the holiday of Chanukah and the lighting of the candles. In other words, it certainly seems to be that even when it was turned into a holiday, that at least initially there were no candles being lit. Okay, so now how do we explain that? So the truth is there's a number of different approaches we can take. One of them comes from Rav Soloveitchik, right? Rav Yosef Ber Soloveitchik was the Rosh Yeshiva at YU, known as the Rav, and he actually suggests an interesting idea, right? We have this concept which we call a Zecher LeMikdash, right? After the Beit HaMikdash is destroyed, in order to not just to remember, but in order to maybe hold on to a certain spirit of the Beit HaMikdash, in order to make it so that when the Beit HaMikdash would be built, that it would rebuilt, it would not be completely like no one has any idea what's going on. They made what was called a Zecher LeMikdash. And Rav Soloveitchik suggests that initially, right, when the Maccabim, when they retook over the Beit HaMikdash, they had a real menorah there. There was no reason to have a holiday where you were going to commemorate the lighting of the menorah in the Beit HaMikdash, because each day you lit the menorah in the Beit HaMikdash. It's only when the Beit HaMikdash is destroyed about 230 or so years later that all of a sudden now they make a Zecher LeMikdash, and since we're not actually lighting the actual menorah that they lit, we're going to now light menorahs on our own to remember that. So that would explain why, right? I mean, and this is already after the time of Josephus, so that would explain why, even though maybe if there had been some, the miracle that happened at the time, it didn't lead to an actual practice of lighting anything. So, the fact that he would know that there was something involving light, it wouldn't necessarily, he wouldn't necessarily be familiar with what it had to do. Now, where do we get this from? I mean, it's very nice that Soloveitchik says this, but yeah.
We don't say Zecher LeMikdash when you light the candle.
Right. Okay. So I'm going to show you though that there's a number of indications that it's actually Zecher LeMikdash. both in terms of what a number of the Rishonim say, and as well as even certain halachot that we do. I mean, you're right. I mean, like right that's thing. We think of it as primarily Pirsumei Nisa, but Rav Soloveitchik points out that there seems to be this idea. Right? In other words, the first thing is the Gemara itself. Right? In other words, it doesn't actually say, even when it says Lashana Acheret, when they established it, they don't actually. It doesn't ever say that they established it with the lighting of candles. Now, he points out, especially if I could find it. Interestingly, he puts the two holidays, D'Rabbanan, of Purim and Chanukah together. So I should be somewhere here in the back. Here we go. Right, first it's Hilchot Megillah, and then all of a sudden in the third parak it changes. And at the beginning he kind of goes through a whole history of the holiday of Chanukah. And then in Halacha Gimel it says, because of this, the whole story, the Chachamim established Oto Dor in that generation, Shmona Yemei Elu, these 8 days, Tchilatan Chavhei B'Kislev, which begin on the 25th of Kislev, Yemei Simcha V'Halel. Now, if you look in the Rambam, there's no punctuation there, so a lot of people read it. So what did they establish? That it should be days of simcha, of rejoicing, maybe with food or however we're going to rejoice. V'halel, and saying halel. Umadlikim behem neirot be'erev al pirchei abatim, and we light candles. Makes it sound like that's what the Chachamim established. But Rav Soloveitchik, and I think it's based on a pretty clear reading of the Gemara, says no. What is it? The Chachamim established that it should be Yemei simcha v'halel. Period. And what do we do on those days? Umadlikim bahem hanerot. In other words, Rav Soloveitchik read within the Rambam that the Rambam was saying that the original holiday was just a holiday of simcha, of hoda'ah and halel and simcha, and that's it. Nothing about candles. And then somehow the candles evolved. So that's one place. It's not a slam dunk proof, but it's it's reading of the Rambam. The second one is that if we look in the back of the Gemara, that scary part of the Gemara that that we never ever look at. But the back of the Gemara, they have a number of different Rishonim, and one of them, this is going to be rough because I'm an old man. One of them is, you have the Ran, who's one of the big Rishonim in the back, and then at the bottom you have a number of other Rishonim, and one of them is you have the Ramban, but you also have the Baal HaMaor. The Baal HaMaor, I guess appropriately enough for Chanukah, was a Rishon whose name was Rav Zrachia Halevi. I think he lived in the 12th or 13th century, I don't remember exactly. And he says, Leman Amar Asur lehishtamesh leora shel ner Chanukah. According to the opinion that you're not allowed to use, right? There's a machlok. Are you allowed to, sit there and use the light? He doesn't mean roast marshmallows, but count money or whatever it is that someone might be doing to candlelight. So he says, according to that, kol tashmish mashma, everything is forbidden. Afilu tashmish de mitzvah, even if it's something like for a mitzvah purpose. Utashmish kedusha, right? Why? Mishum de kasavar, because he holds kevan shehem, and here's the key words: zecher leneirot u'leshemen shel hechal asurot hein bahanaat kol ikar. Right? Since it's in memory of the neirot of the Beit HaMikdash, the neirot and the shemen of the Beit HaMikdash, you can't get any benefit from it. Just like in the Beit HaMikdash, you couldn't use the oil for any other purpose. You couldn't stand there and do whatever you're going to do. So too over here. So here you have the Baal HaMaor, a Rishon, who clearly is saying that it's Zecher LeMikdash. Right? And then one other Rishon, the Ramban, right? We mentioned before that Bahalotcha a lot of times gets tied into the holiday of Chanukah because it starts off with the lighting of the menorah. So it starts off at the beginning, right? Right before Bahalotcha, right? This is one of those classic cases where the Rishonim look, okay, what's the connection between these two sections? We end up with Parshat Naso, which is that kind of the longest parak in the Torah. I remember as a kid, I would, I'd be sitting there during a Chumash class and wasn't learning, so I would try to figure out what's the longest parak, and I would. So the longest parak in all of Chumash is at the end of Parshat Naso. It's the Nisi'im, right? The 12 Nisi'im. They all bring the korbanot, and it keeps on going through. It'll be Yom HaRishon, it'll be Yom HaSheni. Okay. It's at least easy for the Baal Koreh, but it's awfully long for those of us who have to listen. And it finishes, and then it finishes off, Zot Chanukah HaMizbeach, and then it starts off, I don't know if I'm going to be able to find it here to actually read it inside, but then it starts off with the lighting of the menorah. And there's a famous midrash that says that Aharon HaKohen was very pained by the when the Nisi'im brought forward all of their korbanot, because he didn't have anything. He wasn't part of that. Shevet Levi was not part of that. You had Menashe and Ephraim. That's how you get to 12. Not Shevet Levi. And God says to him, don't worry, you're going to have a mitzvah which is going to last forever. Right? As opposed to the Mishkan, which is not going to last forever, you're going to have a mitzvah that's going to last forever. And what is that? Beginning of the next parsha, the lighting of the menorah. And the Ramban says, that's very nice as long as you have a Beit HaMikdash, but what about afterwards? And he says, that's the lighting of the menorah of Chanukah. So again, Rav Soloveitchik suggests that we actually, again, the idea over here is that the lighting of the menorah on Chanukah is a zecher, for the candles, which were, and the menorah and the Beit HaMikdash. So again, we have this idea, and we even see it a little bit in halacha, right? Now, because generally we think of,
you read it.
Right, we do read this section, and even
it goes into Balahotcha.
Right. Around the last day we go into Balahotcha, and usually we think of Hanukkah. It's a family holiday, right? You either light it at the entranceway to your house, or by the window, or on the table, depending on all sorts of circumstances that we're not going to get into. It's a holiday, right? Ner Ishu Beito, and then there's Mahadran Mina Mahadran, all those things. But there's also there's a strange minhag that we also light it in the Beit Knesset, right? Between Mincha and Ma'ariv each day which is very strange, because again, it's not a, there's no, mitzvah to do Persumei Nisan any other way, you don't have to, not to, of course, start up with any religious group or anything. You don't have to drive around with a menorah on the roof of your car, or light them in a public park, or take out billboards on highways. So why all of a sudden, why are we lighting it in the shul? So my Rosh Yeshiva, Rav Berzon, who was the Rosh Yeshiva of Mevaseret, although when I went there it was called Shiur Yerushalayim. Like all good yeshivas, it split and there was a fight. So he pointed out. He said that we're lighting it in the Beit Knesset because the Beit Knesset is Mikdash Ma'at. And he said because of this idea, and he was a Talmud of Soloveitchik, because of this idea that there's a Zecher LeMikdash, so therefore we're lighting it in the Beit Knesset because there's the Zecher. And he said not only that, where do you light it? Right? Almost everything we do in the shul is towards the east or towards Eretz Yisrael, depending on where you are. But here it says you light it in the south. Why? Because in the Beit HaMikdash, right, in the actual Heichal, you had the first you came to the Mizbeach, which was used for the Ketoret, for the spices, for the incense. And then if you went to the right, you had the Shulchan. And to the left, on the southern side, right, you were facing west, so the southern side was the menorah. So again, we see, there really are, and I think I don't remember all of it, but he gave a whole shiur on all these things that had to do with Zecher HaMikdash, but we see already that they're clearly, so part of it is this Zecher HaMikdash. So in other words, one very strong possibility is that Josephus didn't know about, it was already hundreds of years afterwards, which is, a decently long amount of time, and menorah, there was no mitzvah yet to light the menorah, so he didn't know about it. So that's one basic approach. There's a second approach, and part of the thing that's nice about this approach is that you get to learn, some of those parts of Tanakh that none of us ever learn. Somehow, I don't even know how, but the cover of my Treyasar is starting to come off. Maybe because I've used it the past couple of weeks. I assure you, I've not used it much ever before. So in the second Beit HaMikdash, right, Yirmiyahu already, which I didn't actually, I couldn't find it on the shelf. I don't know if one of my kids took it or just I left it somewhere. I have no idea. But Yirmiyahu, talks about already he was warning about the Beit HaMikdash going to be destroyed, but he also said that there was going to be a second Beit HaMikdash, and that but it was going to have to be built not only just in terms of the Jews physically returning, but they were going to also have to return to God. All right, and we know that the whole Purim story, however that works out historically, the Jews come back, and initially they don't actually build the Beit HaMikdash. All they do at first is they build a Mizbeach, right? It's actually one of these things that a lot of people don't know, but you don't necessarily need a Beit HaMikdash for all Korbanot. There are certain Korbanot that can only be done in the Beit HaMikdash. Some you could, in theory, do there, right? There was actually, who was it? There's one of the big rabbis in the 19th century who was very, one of the first, religious Zionists. So, in the 19th century, he was very into this idea that, okay, at least if we can't build the Beit HaMikdash, we should go back to Yerushalayim and start giving sacrifices again. Now, could you imagine, if they're if they're trying to kill us because, you try to pray a few words, imagine if, we were, slaughtering, cows and bulls and sheep, it would not be going over well. And maybe I guess fortunately it didn't exactly work out. But they first build the mizbeach. They're not really even given permission to build the right away. They're not given permission to build the Beit Hamikdash. Some of the non-Jews who were already there are kind of trying to cause problems for them. And finally, they're given permission. But the whole thing is very difficult. I mean, a lot of the Jews. I mean, and there's a lot of parallels to modern day Israel. A lot of the Jews, even when they're given the opportunity to return, kind of sit back and say, like, no, we're comfortable here. Thanks very much. We'll let we'll let everybody else do it. And a small amount of Jews return, and it becomes, it's not such a simple thing that right away they start building the Beit Hamikdash. And ultimately you have Zerubbabel, who's in, we talked about him in the song Malastor, and you have a number of Nevi'im, you have Chagai and Zechariah, who kind of talk a little bit about what's going on over there, that the Beit Hamikdash is not being built. And if you look at the beginning of Chagai, right, so that's the first nevuah. It says right over there, Shnat Shtayim L'Daryavesh HaMelech. Okay, you have in the second year of the king Daryavesh, B'chodesh Hashishi, which is Elul, B'yom Echad L'Chodesh, Dvar Hashem B'yad Chagai Hanavi El Zerubbabel ben Shaltiel, Petach Yehuda, he was a governor, and also to Yehoshua ben Yotzadak the Kohen Gadol. Ko Amar Hashem Tzvakot Lemor. This is what you should say to the people. Ha'am hazeh amru lo eit bo et beit Hashem libanot. Right, the people were they were being very frum. They didn't want to say like we don't want to build it. So they're saying like it's not the right time yet. No. Like, this is not what Yirmiyahu meant. We shouldn't do it. So this is what the people are saying. So what does God say in response to that? Vayehi dvar Hashem biyad Chagai hanavi lemor ha'et lachem atem lashevet bebatechem svunim. You're living in your nice houses which have roofs on that. Somehow you've worked that out. V'habayit hazeh charev, but the Beit Hamikdash is destroyed. Right? God is basically saying to them like, okay, like let's get real over here. You're not being really honest. You're not really building the Beit Hamikdash for religious reasons. You're doing it basically because you don't really care. Okay, and then later on in the parak you have a 1 second. Okay, and the people hear this and they start to have a little bit of fear, and okay, this is the beginning. They start to think about, okay, maybe we'll build the Beit Hamikdash. Now it doesn't exactly happen, and then in the second parak you start going through again. Now listen over here. Be'esrim va'arba, on the 24th day, L'chi'i, which is the month of Kislev, the 24th day of Kislev, okay, the day before what we call Chanukah. Of course, this is before that. There's no second Beit Hamikdash even yet. B'shnat shtayim l'daryavesh hayad dvar Hashem biyad Chagai hanavi lemor. And basically what happens is God tells him to go and gather the Kohanim and give them a little test. And it sounds like he's just kind of like getting them ready. Are you fit to be Kohanim? Do you know the halakha? And he says, if a person carries basar kodesh b'knaf bigdo, let's say someone is carrying a piece of korban meat in his jacket, v'naga b'knafo el halechem ve'el hanazid ve'el hayayin ve'el hashemen ve'el kol ma'achal hayikdash, and he touches with his clothing any other type of food. Does that other food become holy just because he's carrying a piece of meat from the korban? And they say, no, it doesn't. Just because you're carrying a piece of holy meat and you touch it with something else, it doesn't become kodesh. Okay, excellent, great, you guys are 1 for 1, right? Vayomer Chagai im yigat me nefesh b'chol eila hayitma. But if someone who's tamei would touch any of these things, would he become tamei? V'yanu hakohanim v'yomru yitma. They say, yep, he'd become tamei. Excellent, 2 for 2. Awesome, okay, they're going to pass the test. Vayan Chagai, vayomer ken ha'am hazeh v'chen hagoy hazeh lifnei Hashem ne'um Hashem v'chol ha'maseh yedem asher yakruvu sham tamehu. So now, according to the Ibn Ezra, this is all a sketch. This is not really, he's not really gathering them because he wants to actually test them. This is actually really a mashal. Right, just like David, right? When it came to David HaMelech, right after he took Bathsheba and he got Uriah killed, right? Just like Natan HaNavi, when he comes to him, he doesn't come and say, David, you're a pig, you killed that woman. He says, there's this guy, and he had this sheep, and the other guy had a lot of sheep, and he took and David says, and then David says, and he says, Ata Ha'ish. It's really a mashal about you. So the Ibn Ezra says that's what's going on over here. Right? Basically, he asks 2 questions. One is, if you're carrying something kodesh, by touch, can you turn other things kodesh? In other words, is it easy to turn something more kodesh than it's been? And the answer is no. But when it comes to tum'ah, when it comes to things that are impure, can you make something that's pure impure just by touching it? And the answer is yes. And what is God saying? Get your act together. It's not, you're not just going to end up with a Beit HaMikdash. If you kind of act in an impure way, that's going to rule the day. It's not just, you can't just kind of sit there lazily. And that's what he says. He says, from this point forward, that, the korbanot that you give are not going to be accepted. Basically, it's not enough that you have this mizbeach. Get your act together. It's time for you to build the Beit HaMikdash. And finally, and this is it right there, and finally the people start getting ready to build the Beit HaMikdash. They take this. And again, when is this warning given? On 24th day of Kislev, which means that that's the day where they're warned. They start building it on the 25th of Kislev. Okay? And in fact, later on in the next Sefer, in the Sefer of Zechariah, which the first 6 prakim are all about the return, and in fact we even read it as the Haftarah on Chanukah. Right? Zechariah also is basically telling them about all these different visions, and he ends up talking a lot about the menorah and all these different things. And he has this whole mashal. Let's see, do I have this in the right place? I think so. Maybe. All right, I'm not. Let me 1 second. Did I write this down the wrong way? In any case, it talks about right. It says Vayan Vayomer. Right. One of the things that we don't think about is that a Navi didn't get a clear message that said, "Here's what God's saying." They would get a vision, except for Moshe, and they had to figure out what it was. So in Perek Daled, you have this vision, and God says, and Zechariah says, "I don't know what it means." Vayan Vayomer Elai Lemor Zedvar Hashem al Zerubbabel Lemor. This is the message to Zerubbabel. Lo b'chayil v'lo b'koach ki im beruchi amar Hashem tzvakot. Don't think that building the Beit HaMikdash is just going to be a physical thing, but ruchi also. It's going to have to be. You're going to not. And this echoing Yirmiyahu. You're not just going to have to return physically, but there's going to have to be a spiritual element there, right? And in fact, later on in Zechariah, when it talks about again in Perek Vav, it talks about how there's going to be a time when the Jews are going to finally get things going, right? So Rashi actually goes right ahead and says, okay, this I might have written down the wrong way, so I can't quote it right inside. But Rashi says that the whole analogy that it talks about there, that you're going to finally overcome the nations that are against you, that this is actually a hint to Chanukah. So here you have a whole story in Tanakh which revolves around building the second Beit HaMikdash, and it's being done. They're being told to do it on the 24th of Kislev. Seemingly, the implication is that they actually start on Chaf Hey Kislev, and that and all of a sudden now a bunch of a few hundred years later, you now have the Hellenists. They come in, the Greeks come in, and the Greeks actually they put an idol in the sanctuary, and this is according to the Book of Maccabees. This is not like the rabbis playing games to make it work. They put an idol in the sanctuary on the 15th day of Kislev, and they start offering sacrifices on the 25th day of Kislev. Now, whether the Hellenists did this on purpose, as kind of like this, the Beit HaMikdash was initially built on the 25th of Kislev, and now we're going to mess it up on the 25th day of Kislev. At the very least, it's a pretty interesting coincidence. And then the other thing is, right, we usually say, right, we always tell kids, why is it called Chanukah? Because they rested on the 25th. But if the truth is, if you look, and the truth is, most of the Rishonim seem to say that basically the way they say it over is that the Maccabim, they won the war and then they went right into the Beit HaMikdash and they couldn't find any oil and the miracle happened. But if you look in the book, in the book of Maccabees, there's a number of things over there already by Gimel Kislev they start to be successful, and by Chaf Gimel they've already won. So why do they wait till Chaf Hey? Because of what we just saw. Chaf Hey is the day when the second Beit HaMikdash was built. It was also the day when it was defiled. And now they go and they rededicate it on the 25th. So again, here we see an idea that again, the initial, return of Chanukah, and again, remembering what we saw from Zechariah and from Yirmiyahu, right? There's a whole question, right? In other words, it's not just enough, right? What was the whole message of Zechariah and Yirmiyahu as well? It's not just enough to build the Beit HaMikdash. It's not just physical, but it's going to have to be spiritual. So why is there a miracle of the oil? Because the Maccabim, it's been a war. There's nothing necessarily holy about it. There's nothing miraculous, right? There's no book of Tanakh, right? There's nothing that shows it. So how does God show that, the approval of what's been going on? When there's a miracle that occurs, then you realize, okay, there's not just there were plenty of military victories in history that we didn't turn into a holiday. Maybe that's where this idea, of the oil seems to come in. There's also a whole bunch of things in terms of, in terms of the mitzvah of truma, you were actually able to of bikurim, we're actually able to bring bikurim for the olives at that point. There's a lot of stuff involving light there. So you could say that maybe, again, you'd have to still figure out why the story's not there, but you could say that the whole story of Hanukkah is not just randomly happening now with the Greeks, but really is tied into this whole idea about the second Beit HaMikdash. But the question is, why does this all change, right? So in other words, we've spoken about, there was the military victory. It's what the book of, Sefer Maccabim talks about. It's what Josephus talks about. How does it work out that all of a sudden this starts to change? And here it's important to recognize that basically, right, you get to the second Beit HaMikdash, and at the end of the second Beit HaMikdash, what happens? The Romans destroy the Beit HaMikdash, and the Jews, kind of are very, very upset about this. And about 60 years later, there's an uprising, right? The religious leader is none other than Rabbi Akiva, and he says, the pasuk Darach, we spoke about this last week, Darach Kochav Miyakov, who is that talking about? Bar Kosiva, he becomes known as Bar Kochva, and Bar Kochva, if you look at the coins from from his rebellion, right? If you look at the coins, he uses imagery of menorot. He's basically trying to say, what the Maccabees were against the Greeks, I am against the Romans. Right? This is going to be another, we're going to get the Beit HaMikdash back. We're going to rededicate it, and I'm going to be just like Yehuda Maccabee. But only it doesn't work out this time. This time, things fail and they lose. And now they've had 2 rebellions against the Romans, and the Romans are. They're not the nicest guys, and they've had enough. They put an idol in the Beit HaMikdash. They totally, where the Beit HaMikdash was, they call Yerushalayim Aliyah Kapatalina. They're finished. So at this point, all of a sudden, it might not be in the best interest of the Jewish people to be talking about military victories and about how, it's probably a good idea to kind of hang low and not talk about battles against, the evil empire. It's just, which in those days didn't mean the Yankees. It meant, meant the Romans, right? So it's, so there seems to be this transformation that takes place over here where the Jews, right? We spoke about all this last week in terms of where the Jews are starting to live more among the Christians, and the Christians are on the rise, and we know that they're going to, it's going to become the religion of, so it seems to be that there's a purposeful de-emphasis of the military side, and all of a sudden we're going to focus more on the spiritual side, and that would explain why the Gemara and everything subsequently seems to talk a lot more about the nace of the oil rather than the military victory. However, there are a number of places where they decided that they were going to still kind of hint at the military victory. In other words, they don't want to say it outright. They don't want to actually come out and say oh yeah, we killed those Greeks, and because remember this, the whole idea of Esav is, the Greeks descend from Esav, and the Romans descend from Esav, and then the Christians descend from Esav. So if you say these things too much, too openly, it's going to be a little bit, it's not such a good idea. So basically, I would say, and this will be the last part of the shiur. There's really 3 things that they do that really connect to the military victory, that if you know how to read it, it's there. And one of them is actually from this week's parsha, right? This week's parsha, Parshat Vayeshev. And the important thing to remember over here is that these parshiot are always read at this time of year, right? The parshiot of Vayeshev, Miketz, they're always around Hanukkah, and it's not by accident. In other words, even though we see it's set up this way, the parshiot are set up in a way that this always falls out, and there was a whole way the Chachamim set it up in a way. Once they went to the permanently to the 1-year cycle, you're supposed to read Ki Tavo before the end of the year. There's all these rules, so it's not any time you have it, if it's going to always be that this falls out by Hanukkah, it's not by chance. So there's two things to look at. One is already a couple of weeks ago by Parshat Vayeishev in Perek Lamed Pasuk Chafei. Right, where it talks about where Yaakov runs away. He ends up in the house of Lavan. He gets married and gets married again, gets married again, gets married again. Right, unlike rich people today, it's only it's without any divorces. He has four wives and he starts having children. And he has 11 sons and at least one daughter. According to the Midrash, he had other daughters as well. Fine, but according to the Pshat, he has 12 children. And after each birth, fine, keeps on having children. And then all of a sudden, in Pasuk Chavhei. Vayehi ka'asher yalda Rachel et Yosef. Right after Rachel gives birth, Vayomer Yaakov el Lavan, Shalcheni v'alchal mekomi v'lartzi. I'm out of here. It's time for me to go. Somehow there's something about the birth of Yosef that makes it that I'm ready to go. Right? And if you look, again,
material for the cook.
Right, so it says over here, Rashi says, Kasher yalda Rachel et Yosef, mishenolad sitno shel Esav. Right, why is it that he's going to go now? Because Yosef is the one who's going to take down Esav. Somehow, and again, in what way we're talking about this and when this comes true, but it's, he's going to be the one. Right, and we see that even more in this week's parasha, right, at the beginning of Vayeishev, right, it starts off and it says, Vayeishev. That part I know. It definitely starts with the word Vayeishev. Vayeishev Yaakov be'eretz Megurei Aviv be'eretz Canaan. Eile toldot Yaakov Yosef ben Shva'asar Shana. These are the generations of Yaakov, and then it only mentions Yosef. So the Midrash, which Rashi quotes, kind of goes off on this. It's kind of strange. Like, why of all things? Why? If you're going to say these are the generations of Yaakov, why would you start off with Yosef? So it points out very, very interesting Midrash. Right, last week's parsha finishes off with the descendants of Esav. He's going to have all these alufim, he's going to have all these generals, these leaders, and according to the Midrash, Yaakov hears this, and he's kind of freaked out. Right? He's like, whoa, this is, Esav's a pretty powerful guy, he hates my guts, this is pretty bad news. So what happens? So the Midrash says, one second. Here we go. Okay. Vayaveh Yosef atibat. Makativ l'mala min ha'inyan. So what's written before? El ela alufei b'nei Esav. Right? It mentions that. So kevan shara Yaakov alufei b'nei Esav nit yareh. He became very afraid. Amar miyuchal amod kneged alufim elu. I mean, these guys, they're going to kill us. This is crazy. So now it says mashal l'maha davar domen. Now pay attention to the details of the mashal. L'gmalim harbei shahayu teunim pishtan. You have a bunch of camels which are carrying flax. Haya Omeid Hanafach, the blacksmith, is standing there, Vitameh, and he's worried. V'amar Hechani Kanes Kol HaPishtan Hazeh. Right, he's standing there and he's got like a whole, I don't know what you call them, a flock, he's got a whole camel load of camels coming at him, a pack of camels, I don't know, right?
Sounds good enough.
Right, a pack of wild camels carrying flax, and he's worrying like, where are they going? I'm right here. So, Pikeach Echad Hayasham, there was a smart guy standing there, and he says to this blacksmith, Amarlo, where he says, what are you worried about? Nitzotz Echad Yotzemi Mapuach Shalcha. You smack your hammer on the, whatever they call that metal thing that blacksmiths smack their hammer on. One spark goes out, and all that flax is gone. Don't worry about it. One spark from you is going to burn up all of that flax. Okay, that's the Midrash. What's the Nimshal? Gate shel, right? Amarlo Hakadosh Baruch Hu, Gate shelcha yechaleh otam v'zeh Yosef. What is all that flax? The flax is represented. That represents Esav. The camels and the flax that represents Esav. What's the spark that's going to destroy Esav? Yosef. Right? And therefore, Yosef represents the one who's going to destroy. And that's why, as soon as Yosef is born, that's when he's ready to go back. Now he can go face Esav, because Yosef, who's the one who's going to ultimately destroy Esav, is born. Now, now it's an interesting midrash. What is it getting at? Fine. How exactly does Yosef do it? We can talk about that another time. But there's actually a very, we said that there are very few Gemarot which actually talk about Chanukah. Now, listen to this. Right at the end of the 6th parak of Baba Kama, which again is, it's right in the middle of all the Babas. It's all this, it's basically talking about damages. Not where you would expect anything to involve Chanukah. Now, listen to the details, remembering that midrash. Gate sheyatza mitachat hapatish. If you have a spark that comes out from the hammer, in other words, we're talking about a blacksmith, Vehizik chayav. If it does damage, you're chayav, right? You're blacksmith, you're pounding on it, and somehow you cause a fire, it does damage. You have to pay for it. It's your fault. You have to be careful. Gamal shahayat ta'un pishtan. A camel that was carrying flax. And by the way, the same Gemara is also brought down in the Sechet Shabbat, right by those Chanukah Gemarot. Right? A camel which was carrying flax, v'nichnas pishtano, v'avar b'reshut harabim, and it's passing in public, v'nichnas pishtano letoch hachanut, right? Imagine camels traveling through the shuk. So now they're carrying lots of flax, and the flax goes into like one of those stalls. And they go in, v'dalko b'nei rosh al chenvani, and they light on fire. You can imagine this in a movie, like just total pandemonium breaks loose. The flax lights on fire. V'hidlik and abira. The whole building is starting to burn. Baal gamal chayav. Since his camels with the flax went into a place that they shouldn't have been, and then he has to pay. However, let's say he put the candle outside of his store, and then the camel's flax lit on fire, and then the whole place burned down. Then the chenvani is chayav. Rabbi Yehuda Omer bener Chanukah patur. When it comes, you're right, because what are you doing putting your fire outside of a place that's it's the public street? You can't put it there. Rabbi Yehuda says if it's Chanukah candles, then he's patur, because you're allowed to put them there. It seems hard to say, especially they bring down this Gemara. You could say, why do they bring down this Gemara? Because it mentions Chanukah. But again, what did we just say? We just said this whole idea of Esav being represented by these camels with flax, and Yosef's going to destroy it. And now you have this halacha about this, about camels and flax, and a spark which can destroy it. Again, it seems to me that this is one of those places where the Chachamim kind of put in surreptitiously, kind of just sneaking it in, a little bit of an idea that at some time in the future, the Alufei Sav, these, who it's going to be the Greeks, and one day it's going to be the Romans, we're going to defeat them. Now again, they didn't want to say this out loud. They didn't want them to say like, oh, another rebellion, let's just kill them all. But they put this in there, right? A second idea, right, as we said, is the fact that they put this section of Kriyat HaTorah right there. Right? We usually, in other words, these days it's not politically correct to speak about the Mityavnim. Right, the Hellenizing Jews. Right, in other words, imagine, imagine the cartoon, and there were some Jews who were assimilating, and the real Jews went out and forced them to either become religious or they would die. Right, that doesn't go over so well in our politically correct generation. It just wouldn't go over well. So we always talk about the Jews defeated the Greeks, but the truth is that a lot of the story is the Jews defeated the Mityavnim. Right, right. And in fact, if you look in Al Hanesim, which we say in Birkat Hamazon and in the Amidah as well. Right, it talks about Tmeim biyad tahorim. The phrase Tmeim is not used to talk about non-Jews. It's talking about the Mityavnim. So again, what are we about to read? We're about to get into Vayeishev with Yosef, who's the one who's going to defeat Esav. And also, but initially here, you have the battle which takes place between Yosef and his brothers. This is the first, or not the first really, Cain and Hevel is really the first, but this is, this represents the Chachamim civil war. Right, so in other words, they purposely they set up that the parshiot of Vayeshev and Miketz and maybe even Vayigash would be around the time of Chanukah to hint at the idea of Chanukah being about this battle, which also involved, fighting against the Jews, against other Jews. I threw it out as a possibility. I actually mentioned it to someone who's a PhD candidate, I think at Harvard, University of Chicago, somewhere impressive that I would never get into. Whether maybe one of the reasons they didn't want to even talk about civil war was the fact that the Christians were kind of growing, and since they had come out of Judaism, and she thought it was a little bit of a stretch, but okay, but at the very least, they certainly are purposely putting this parsha there. And the last thing that I'll say that I think really maybe perhaps ties it into the again, where they hinted to the military victory, even though they were now talking about the Pach Hashem, is the story of the Pach Hashem itself. Because if you think about it, think about the mashal. Let's think of this. Let's say it's a mashal, right? You have the Greeks come in, and they make all of the oil impure. Who do they make impure? The Jewish people. They create mityavnim. And most of the Jews become Yavnim. But they go and they find this one small jug of oil, which has the seal of the Kohen Gadol. There's one group of Kohanim who don't become Tameh, who don't become Mityavnim, And even though you would think what would happen in the civil war between a large group and a small group, you would think the impure oil would win and the little jug of oil would only last for a short amount of time. Even though it should have lasted for a small amount of time, it lasts for 8 days. So one could suggest, again, not necessarily suggesting that it's purely a mashal, but that at the very least it could possibly partially be a mashal for the military victory as well. That in other words, even when they focused on the Pach HaShemen as the story, even though initially, as we saw very clearly, initially the military side was much bigger. Initially, it seems very, very clear that there was not right away a holiday involving lighting of the menorah. Even though, again, the date of Chav Hei Kislev was certainly a date for rededicating the Beit HaMikdash, but the oil part, the whole candle part was not necessarily talked about. But it could be when they switched this focus, because they didn't want to be openly militaristic. They didn't want to be talking about war. By talking about the Pach HaShemen, they were really hinting to the military victory as well. That on some level you could read it at least in part as a mashal. Just to wrap things up very, very quickly, there's a lot of discussion. I actually, while I was in LA this week, I was speaking to a rabbi out there, just about generally, like how do you balance kind of being involved in, if I'm interested in kind of academic approaches and also interested in more, also not becoming a heretic. I want to believe in Judaism and God and all those things. How do you balance this? And it really, Chanukah is fascinating. I'm reading this book right now about existential thought, and it's kind of going through the history of philosophy. And on some level, even though the Rambam tries it, the Christians had their equivalent, lahavdil. You had Thomas Aquinas. If you've heard of St. Thomas, it's either a nice island or a holy Christian guy. He also would just, again, lahavdil, but just like the Rambam, he attempted to take Aristotle's Greek philosophy, where the mind, everything could be figured out rationally, and everything could be known objectively, and anything we see is real, and anything that we don't see is not real. And they attempted to smush it together with religion. And I don't know. I don't think I'm the only one who feels this. I can't speak to Christianity, but I think to some degree with the Rambam, it was a very, very forced thing, because religion and Judaism in particular really is. We do talk about nisim. We do talk about that. Even though you could possibly show that there was something. You could talk about there was something chemically within the oil that made it last for that amount of time. No, we believe that God involves Himself in the fate of man, and that on some level, we try to, that's why I start off with this idea from Rav Kook, from his Sefer Midbar Shor, that we can ask questions and we can talk about, hey, how come the miracle of oil only appears at a certain time? And and again, the academics might take a certain approach, but we always have to remember that ner tamid in the middle. We always have to, whatever it is that we're focusing on. In other words, like after I've been reading a bunch of things on this, like I sat there, on the plane. The airlines have been doing me a great favor, and they've taken off all movies from the plane. So so I've got to do something on these flights. So I bring Svarim and I learn a little bit. And I was learning through a sefer of Rav Kook, who I've quoted before. He's this Hasidic Rebbe of at the beginning of the 20th century. A big Kabbalist, very, very creative, but again, certainly not a pure rationalist. And I think, and again, somehow, we don't have to, fully reject the Greek idea. Certainly all of modern science is based on that. And without Greek philosophy, general philosophy would never get off the ground. All sorts of ideas of science, of scientific, experiment and proofs and all those kind of things would never get off the ground. But at the end of the day, we have to remember that as far as we can go with that, and as much as we can be involved in the world of science and math and rational thought, that there's this ner tamid in the middle, there's this emunah that we have in Hashem, not because we could prove it, not because it's, some, sort of rational proof that you can demonstrate that God exists, or you can demonstrate, Matan Torah, but emunah, which doesn't just mean, belief, but trust in. We have to ultimately have this trust in Hashem, that even when we have questions, and even when they seem to, when there are all these, academics around us telling us like, there's no God, and there's no Tanakh, and there's no, it's all man-made and everything like that. We have to remember this ner tamid, that everything we do, all our studies, all our questions, all of our struggles, to try to focus on that middle candle, which represents our relationship with Hashem.